The August sun beat down mercilessly on the barren stretch of land outside Hays City, Kansas, and Katherine Ann Hartley felt every blister on her palms as she drove the shovel into the stubborn earth one more time. The year was 1873, and the drought had turned the Kansas plains into something resembling hell itself, all cracked dirt and dust devils that spun across the horizon like vengeful spirits. Her husband had been dead 3 months now, taken by cholera in the spring, and the well he had started before his death remained unfinished, leaving Katherine with a choice between digging or dying of thirst. She had chosen to dig. The shovel hit rock again, sending a jarring vibration up her arms that made her want to weep. Instead, she gritted her teeth and adjusted her grip, feeling the raw flesh of her palms tear open further, blood mixed with dirt on the wooden handle. She had been at this for 6 days straight, rising before dawn and working until her body gave out at dusk. The hole was perhaps 12 feet deep now, but there was still no sign of water, no blessed dampness in the soil to indicate she was close. Katherine wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, squinting up at the sky. The sun was directly overhead, which meant she had been digging for nearly 5 hours without rest. Her dress, once a pretty calico print, was now stained brown with dirt and sweat. Her auburn hair, which she had pinned up carefully that morning, had come loose and hung in damp strands around her face. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. The rhythmic sound of hooves on the hard-packed earth carried across the prairie, growing steadily louder. Katherine straightened, one hand going instinctively to shield her eyes as she looked toward the sound. A lone rider was approaching from the direction of town, moving at an easy canter. She felt a flutter of unease in her chest. Out here, miles from the nearest neighbor, a woman alone was vulnerable in ways she tried not to think about too much. The rider drew closer, and Katherine could make out more details. A tall man on a bay mare wearing dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. As he approached, he slowed the mare to a walk, then stopped about 20 feet from where Katherine stood beside her partially dug well. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Katherine studied him warily, taking in the weathered leather chaps, the gun belt slung low on his hips, the bedroll and saddlebags that marked him as a man who spent more time on the trail than under a roof. He looked to be in his mid-20s, perhaps a few years older than her own 22 years. His face, what she could see of it beneath the hat, was tanned and angular, with several days' worth of dark stubble covering his jaw. He was studying her just as intently, his gaze moving from her blistered hands to the shovel to the hole she had been digging. His eyes, she noticed, were a striking shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the prairie. There was something in his expression she could not quite read, a mixture of concern and something else, something softer. Without a word, he swung down from his horse. Katherine tensed, her grip tightening on the shovel handle despite the pain it caused her torn palms. But the man made no move toward her. Instead, he walked slowly to the edge of the well and looked down into it, assessing the depth and the condition of the earth. Then he turned back to her, and his eyes dropped to her hands again. Katherine followed his gaze and saw what he was seeing. Her palms were a mess of raw, bleeding flesh, the blisters broken and weeping. She had stopped feeling the worst of the pain hours ago, her body numbing itself to the constant agony. But looking at the damage now, seeing it through a stranger's eyes, she felt a wave of something like shame wash over her. The cowboy stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Katherine's heart hammered in her chest, but she held her ground. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was taller than she had realized, 6 feet or more, broad-shouldered and solid. Then he reached out and wrapped his hand around the shovel handle just above where her own hands gripped it. His fingers were warm and calloused. For a heartbeat, Katherine considered refusing, clinging to the shovel and her stubborn independence. But there was something in his face, in those gray-blue eyes, that stopped her. Not pity exactly, but a kind of quiet understanding. She let go. He took the shovel from her without a word, his expression unchanged. Then he turned and walked to the well, lowering himself down into the hole with an athletic ease that spoke of hard physical labor and years of it. Katherine stood there, her empty hands hanging at her sides, not quite knowing what to do with herself now that she was not digging. The sound of the shovel biting into earth resumed, steady and rhythmic. The cowboy worked with an economy of motion that Katherine envied, his movements efficient and powerful. In the time it would have taken her to move half a shovelful of dirt, he had cleared 3 times that amount. She watched him work, still uncertain whether she should protest, whether she should insist on taking back her shovel and her task. But her hands were throbbing now, the pain returning as the shock wore off. And there was something almost mesmerizing about watching him work, about the steady, methodical way he attacked the stubborn Kansas earth. After a few minutes, Katherine realized she was swaying slightly on her feet. The heat, the exhaustion, the sudden cessation of activity after days of relentless physical labor, it was all catching up with her at once. She made her way on unsteady legs to the scraggly cottonwood tree that stood about 30 yards from the well site. It was the only tree on her property, a lonely sentinel that provided a few precious feet of shade. Katherine sank down onto the ground at its base, leaning her back against the rough bark. From here she could still see the well, could watch the cowboy's hat bobbing up and down as he dug. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, the sun had moved perceptibly across the sky and her neck was stiff from the angle at which she had been sleeping. Katherine sat up with a start, momentarily disoriented. Then she remembered the cowboy, the well, and she turned to look. He was still digging. His hat lay on the ground beside the well now, and she could see his dark hair, damp with sweat and plastered to his head. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to the muscles of his back and shoulders. As she watched, he paused, setting the shovel aside and reaching for something. A canteen, she realized, which must have been hanging from his saddle. He took a long drink, then poured some of the water over his head, running his hand through his hair to slick it back. Katherine felt a pang of guilt at her own thirst, but she had not brought her canteen with her when she fled to the shade of the tree. Her water supply was in the house, such as it was. She had been rationing carefully, knowing that every drop was precious until the well was finished. The cowboy was looking at her now, she realized. He had noticed she was awake. He held up the canteen in a silent question, offering to share. Katherine hesitated, then nodded. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky, and walked back toward the well. As she approached, he climbed up out of the hole, moving with the same easy grace despite what must have been hours of hard labor. He handed her the canteen without speaking. Katherine took it gratefully, raising it to her lips and drinking deeply. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the most delicious thing she had consumed in days. She forced herself to stop after a few swallows, not wanting to drain his supply. She handed the canteen back to him, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Katherine felt a strange jolt at the contact, something that had nothing to do with pain or exhaustion. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she saw something flicker in their depths before he looked away. "Thank you," Katherine said. The first words either of them had spoken since he had arrived. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw by dust and thirst. He nodded, a small dip of his head, but did not respond verbally. Instead, he capped the canteen and hung it back on his saddle. Then he returned to the well, preparing to climb back down and resume digging. "Wait," Katherine said, finding her voice again. "You don't have to do this. I can manage." He paused, one foot already in the hole, and looked at her. Really looked at her, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then his eyes dropped to her hands again, to the raw, bleeding flesh that she had hidden behind her back without realizing it. "I know you can," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting. "But you do not have to." Before she could formulate a response, he had lowered himself back into the well and resumed digging. Katherine stood there for a long moment, her heart doing something strange and fluttery in her chest. Then she turned and walked toward the house, her mind made up. If he was going to help her, the least she could do was offer him a proper meal. The house was a simple structure, just 3 rooms that her husband had built when they first claimed this land 2 years ago. It was sturdy enough, with thick sod walls that kept out the worst of the heat and cold, but it was small and cramped and perpetually dusty no matter how much Katherine swept. She pushed open the door and stepped into the relative cool of the interior, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. Her supplies were meager. The drought had killed most of her garden, and with no way to preserve meat in this heat, she had been living mainly on beans, hardtack, and the occasional prairie chicken she managed to shoot with her husband's old rifle. But she had some salt pork that she had been saving, and there were still a few potatoes left in the root cellar. It would have to do. Katherine set about preparing the meal, her torn hands making every task more difficult than it should have been. She had to hold the knife awkwardly to avoid the worst of the blisters, and several times she hissed in pain as she accidentally caught an edge against raw flesh. But she persevered, driven by a determination that she could not quite explain even to herself. By the time the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Katherine had a simple but filling meal prepared. She stepped outside carrying 2 tin plates loaded with fried salt pork, boiled potatoes, and the last of her beans. The cowboy was still in the well, still digging, though the pile of excavated earth beside the hole had grown considerably. "It is time to eat," Katherine called down to him. She was surprised by the authority in her own voice, the firmness of it. The digging sounds paused. Then the cowboy appeared at the edge of the hole, climbing out with movements that were noticeably slower and stiffer than they had been earlier. He was coated in dust and dirt, his clothes filthy, his face streaked with grime and sweat. But when he straightened and looked at her, there was a kind of quiet satisfaction in his eyes that told her they had made real progress. Katherine walked toward the house, and after a moment she heard him following. She had set out 2 chairs beside the small table that stood just outside the front door, the only place where they could eat in something resembling comfort during the oppressive heat. She set the plates down and took one of the chairs, gesturing to the other. The cowboy hesitated, looking down at his filthy clothes and then at the food. Katherine understood his reluctance. "There is a water barrel around the side of the house," she said, "and clean rags if you want to wash up." He nodded and disappeared around the corner of the house. Katherine heard the splash of water, and a few minutes later, he returned. He had removed his shirt and washed the worst of the dirt from his face, neck, and arms. His hair was damp and slicked back from his forehead. Katherine tried not to stare at his bare torso, at the hard planes of muscle that spoke of a life spent in physical labor, but she felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed as he pulled his shirt back on, though it was nearly as dirty as he had been. Then he took the offered chair and looked down at the plate of food with something like wonder. "This is too much," he said quietly. "You should not be using your supplies on me." "You have been digging my well for hours," Katherine replied firmly. "The least I can do is feed you." He did not argue further. Instead, he picked up the fork and began to eat with the focused intensity of a man who had not seen a hot meal in some time. Katherine ate her own food more slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. Now that they were sitting down face to face in the golden light of evening, she found herself studying him more carefully. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, all hard angles and sun-darkened skin. There was a scar on his right forearm, a long white line that looked like it had come from a knife or perhaps barbed wire. His hands, like hers, were calloused and marked by hard work, though his fingers were long and surprisingly graceful as they handled the fork. "I am Katherine," she said after a few minutes of silence. Katherine Hartley. He looked up from his plate, meeting her eyes. For a moment, she thought he was not going to respond. Then he swallowed his mouthful of food and said, Nathaniel Preston. Are you passing through Mr. Preston, Asubri? Katherine asked, genuinely curious. Hayes City saw its share of drifters and cowboys, men working the cattle drives that came up from Texas or following the railroad as it pushed ever westward. But most of them stayed on the main trails, and her homestead was a good 5 miles from town. Just Nathaniel, he said, and there was a hint of something in his voice, a rejection of formality that intrigued her. And I suppose you could say that. I have been working as a ranch hand for the past year down near Abilene, but the outfit folded, decided to head north, see if there was work to be found elsewhere. There is always work to be found in Kansas, Katherine said, though whether it pays well is another question entirely. Something that might have been a smile flickered across Nathaniel's face, gone too quickly for her to be certain. That is the truth of it. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Katherine found herself relaxing in a way she had not done since her husband's death, perhaps even before that. Thomas had been a good man, hard-working and honest, but their marriage had been one of practicality rather than passion. They had been partners in the business of survival, nothing more and nothing less. How deep do you think we need to go? Katherine asked, breaking the silence. Nathaniel considered the question, his brow furrowing slightly. Hard to say. Wells around here can be anywhere from 15 to 30 feet before you hit water. We are at maybe 14 feet now, could be tomorrow, could be another week. Katherine felt her heart sink. Another week? She did not have another week's worth of water, not even with careful rationing. And she certainly could not ask this stranger to stay and dig for that long, no matter how much help he had already provided. Nathaniel must have seen something in her expression because his voice gentled. But the soil is starting to feel different down there, cooler, more packed. I think we are close. Truly? Katherine felt a surge of hope so strong it almost hurt. Truly, he confirmed. If we keep at it tomorrow, I would wager we will hit water by evening. We? Katherine repeated, latching on to the word. You are planning to stay? Nathaniel set down his fork and looked at her directly. If you will have me, yes. I do not make it a habit of leaving jobs half-finished. I cannot pay you, Katherine said quickly. I mean, I have a little money saved, but not much, and I will need it to survive the winter. I am not asking for payment, Nathaniel said, his voice firm. Just a place to bed down for the night and maybe another one of these meals tomorrow if you can spare it. Katherine felt something tight and painful in her chest loosen slightly. I can spare it, she said softly, and you can sleep in the barn. It is not much, but it is clean and dry, and there is fresh hay. Nathaniel nodded. That will do fine. They finished their meal as the sun completed its descent, and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Katherine collected the plates and disappeared into the house to wash them, her mind churning with thoughts she could not quite sort out. When she emerged again, Nathaniel was standing by his horse, removing the saddle and gear with practiced efficiency. The barn is just over there, Katherine said, pointing to the small structure that stood about 50 yards from the house. Help yourself to whatever you need. Thank you, Nathaniel said, and this time his voice held a warmth that made Katherine's heart skip a beat. She watched him lead his horse toward the barn, his tall figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. Then she turned and went back into the house, closing the door behind her and leaning against it for a long moment. That night, Katherine lay in her narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie night. Coyotes called in the distance, their yipping cries carrying across the empty miles. The wind rustled through the grass with a sound like whispered secrets. And somewhere out there, in her barn, a stranger named Nathaniel Preston was sleeping. She had not felt this aware of another person's presence since Thomas died. It was both comforting and unsettling in equal measure. Katherine closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but it was a long time before exhaustion finally claimed her. She woke before dawn, as had become her habit. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, that deep purple blue that preceded the sunrise. Katherine dressed quickly in her work clothes, another calico dress that had seen better days, and wrapped her torn hands in strips of clean cloth. It would make gripping the shovel harder, but she needed some protection for the raw flesh. When she stepped outside, she was surprised to see smoke rising from the direction of the well. She walked toward it, curiosity overriding her usual caution, and found Nathaniel crouched beside a small fire. He had a pot of coffee brewing, the rich aroma carrying across the morning air. "I hope you do not mind," he said, looking up as she approached. "I found the coffee in the barn. Figured it belonged to you, but I thought we could both use some." "I do not mind at all," Katherine said, feeling absurdly pleased by this small gesture. Thomas had never been one for making coffee, always leaving that task to her. Nathaniel poured some of the dark liquid into a tin cup and handed it to her. Katherine wrapped her bandaged hands around it carefully, savoring the warmth and the smell. She took a sip and nearly groaned with pleasure. It was strong and bitter and perfect. They drank their coffee in silence as the sun crept above the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. In the growing light, Katherine could see just how much progress Nathaniel had made on the well the previous day. The hole was noticeably deeper, the pile of excavated earth considerably larger. "I should help," Katherine said, setting down her empty cup. Nathaniel looked at her hands, at the makeshift bandages, and shook his head. "Those need time to heal. Another day of digging will make them worse." "They are my hands, Amrai," Katherine said, a touch of defiance entering her voice, "and it is my well." "That it is," Nathaniel agreed mildly, "but hands that cannot heal are not much use to anyone. Let me finish the digging. You can help in other ways." Katherine wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Her palms were so torn and raw that even the simple act of gripping a coffee cup had sent jolts of pain up her arms. Trying to work a shovel would be agony. "What other ways?" she asked, slightly mollified. "Well," Nathaniel said, standing and brushing off his pants, "once we hit water, we are going to need to line the well to keep the walls from collapsing. You have any stones or timber we could use?" Katherine considered this. "There is a creek bed about 2 miles east of here. It has been dry for months, but there are good-sized rocks along the bottom. And my husband cut some timber last fall, planning to build a bigger barn. It is stacked behind the current one." "The timber will work for the frame," Nathaniel said, nodding. "And if you can manage driving the wagon, we can haul those rocks back later today or tomorrow." It was a plan, a real plan, and Katherine felt a surge of hope mixed with gratitude. "I can manage the wagon," she confirmed. Nathaniel picked up the shovel and headed toward the well, and Katherine watched him lower himself into the hole once more. The rhythmic sound of digging resumed, and she turned back toward the house, her mind already working through what needed to be done. She spent the morning doing the tasks that had been neglected while she'd have focused on digging. She tended to her chickens, collecting the few eggs they had managed to produce despite the heat and lack of good feed. She swept out the house, beat the dust from her bedding, and mended a tear in one of her dresses. All the while, she was aware of the steady sound of the shovel striking earth, of Nathaniel's presence on her land. Around midday, Katherine prepared another simple meal and brought it out to the well. Nathaniel climbed out when she called to him, and she could see immediately that he was making excellent progress. The well was noticeably deeper, and when she peered down into it, she could see the walls were darker, the soil more tightly packed. They ate together again, sitting in the shade of the cottonwood tree. Katherine found herself studying Nathaniel when she thought he was not looking, taking in the details of his face, the way he moved, the quiet competence in everything he did. "Where are you from originally?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Nathaniel took a drink from his canteen before answering. "Virginia," he said. "My family had a farm in the Shenandoah Valley before the war." Katherine understood immediately what he was not saying. The war had ended 8 years ago, but its scars were still fresh, especially for those who had lived through it in the border states in the South. "Did you fight?" she asked softly. "I was too young when it started," Nathaniel said. "Just a boy. But by the end, They were taking anyone who could hold a rifle. I spent the last year in uniform, though I'm not sure you could call what we did fighting. Mostly it was starving and running. There was a bleakness in his voice that made Catherine's heart ache. And your family? Gone, he said simply. Pa died at Gettysburg. Ma and my sister succumbed to fever the winter after the war ended. The farm was destroyed, burned by one army or the other. I never learned which. So I headed west. Figured I would try my luck out here, where the war had not touched things quite so deeply. I am sorry, Katherine said, and she meant it. Her own losses felt small in comparison. Nathaniel shrugged, but she could see the pain in his eyes. It was a long time ago, and the West has been good to me mostly. Taught me how to be useful, how to work cattle and horses, given me a kind of freedom I never would have had back home. But no place to call your own, Katherine observed. No, Nathaniel admitted. No place to call my own, just the trail and whatever ranch will hire me next. They finished their meal, and Nathaniel returned to work. Katherine watched him for a few minutes, then made a decision. She hitched up the wagon, a task that took longer than it should have with her injured hands, but which she managed through sheer determination. Then she drove east toward the dry creek bed, the wagon bouncing and jolting over the rough ground. Finding suitable rocks was easier than she had expected. The creek bed was littered with them, smooth river stones of various sizes. Katherine chose the largest ones she could lift, loading them into the wagon bed one by one. Her hands protested every movement, the bandages quickly becoming stained with blood and dirt, but she pushed through the pain. By the time she drove the loaded wagon back to the homestead, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Katherine was exhausted, her arms trembling with fatigue, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had contributed something real to the project. Nathaniel was not in the well when she arrived. Instead, he was standing at its edge, staring down into the depths with an expression of intense satisfaction. He turned when he heard the wagon approaching, and Katherine saw that his clothes were soaked, not with sweat, but with actual water. "You hit it," she breathed, hardly daring to believe. "About an hour ago," Nathaniel confirmed, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice. "Good strong flow, too. The well is filling nicely." Katherine jumped down from the wagon seat, forgetting her exhaustion and pain in her excitement. She hurried to the edge of the well and looked down. Sure enough, she could see water glinting in the depths, perhaps 4 feet of it already accumulated. It was the most beautiful sight she had seen in months. "Oh," she said, and her voice broke slightly. "Oh, thank God!" She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, hot and unexpected. It was not just the relief of having water again, though that was certainly part of it. It was the sudden, overwhelming realization that she was not going to die out here alone, that she might actually survive this impossible homestead and this brutal land. Katherine became aware that Nathaniel was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. She wiped roughly at her eyes, embarrassed by the tears. "It is a fine well," she said, trying to regain her composure. "You did excellent work." "We did excellent work," Nathaniel corrected gently. "You got it started, and those rocks you brought will be perfect for lining it." They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, hauling the rocks to the well site and beginning the process of lining the walls. It was delicate work, requiring each stone to be carefully positioned to create a stable structure that would not collapse inward. Nathaniel did most of the actual placement, lowering himself into the partially filled well to work, but Katherine handed him stones and offered advice from above. As evening fell, they were both filthy, soaked, and exhausted, but the well was lined halfway up, enough to ensure its stability. They would finish the rest tomorrow, Nathaniel said, along with building a proper frame and pulley system for drawing water. Katherine prepared another meal, using the last of her salt pork and the remaining potatoes. Tomorrow she would need to go to town for supplies, she realized, now that she had water and could leave the homestead without worrying that she would return to find it completely dried out. They ate as they had the previous evening, sitting outside in the cooling air as the stars emerged overhead. Katherine found herself more relaxed than she had been in months. The constant anxiety about water temporarily lifted from her shoulders. "I need to go into Hayes City tomorrow," she said as they ate, "to buy supplies and let the land office know the well is finished. You are welcome to come along if you want. The ride will be easier than walking." Nathaniel considered this, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "I was planning to move on soon," he said slowly. "Head north, maybe up toward Nebraska or the Dakotas. Heard there might be work on some of the big ranches up there." Katherine felt a sudden, sharp disappointment that took her by surprise. Of course he was leaving. Why would he stay? He was a drifter, a man with no ties, and she was just another stranger he had helped along the way. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Well, the offer stands for tomorrow if you want company on the road to town before you head north." "I appreciate that," Nathaniel said. And was it her imagination, or did he sound somewhat reluctant as well? They finished their meal in silence, and Katherine felt the comfortable ease of the previous evening dissipate, replaced by an awkward awareness that this was temporary, that Nathaniel would be gone soon, and she would be alone again. That night, Katherine lay in bed and tried to tell herself that it was for the best. She had only known the man for 2 days. There was no reason for him to stay, and no reason she should want him to. But as she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was of gray-blue eyes and calloused hands gently taking a shovel from her grip. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorcher of a day. Katherine rose early and dressed carefully, choosing her best remaining dress and spending extra time pinning up her hair. She told herself it was because she was going to town, because she wanted to look respectable, but she knew it was more than that. Nathaniel was already up when she emerged from the house, tending to his horse and checking the mare's hooves. He looked up as Katherine approached, and something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "You look nice," he said simply, and Katherine felt warmth flood her cheeks. "Thank you," she managed. They hitched Nathaniel's mare alongside Katherine's aging gelding to pull the wagon, a process that went surprisingly smoothly given that the two horses had never worked together before. Then they set off toward Hayes City, the wagon rattling and bouncing over the rutted trail. The ride took just over an hour, and Katherine found herself hyper-aware of Nathaniel's presence beside her on the wagon seat. Their arms occasionally brushed as the wagon jolted over rough patches, and each time it happened, Katherine felt that same strange electric sensation she had experienced when their hands touched over the canteen. Hayes City was bustling when they arrived, despite the early hour. The town had grown considerably in the past year, swelled by the arrival of the Kansas Pacific Railway and the influx of cowboys, soldiers from nearby Fort Hays, and settlers heading further west. The main street was lined with businesses: a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a livery stable, and various other establishments. Katherine guided the wagon to a stop outside the general store and climbed down, wincing slightly as her still tender hands gripped the side rail. Nathaniel was beside her immediately, offering his hand to help her down. She took it, grateful for the support, and tried not to think about how natural it felt. Inside the store, Katherine moved through the aisles, selecting the supplies she would need: flour, cornmeal, sugar, coffee, beans, a small quantity of salted beef. Her funds were limited, so she had to choose carefully, balancing necessity against cost. She was examining a bolt of fabric, thinking that she really did need to make herself a new dress when she heard raised voices from the front of the store. Katherine looked up to see Nathaniel standing near the counter, facing 3 men who had clearly just entered. They were rough-looking characters, unshaven and dirty, with the swagger of men who were used to intimidating others. The largest of the 3, a bear of a man with a scar running down one cheek, was standing too close to Nathaniel, invading his space in a way that was clearly meant to provoke. "Well, well," the scarred man was saying, his voice carrying across the store, "if it is not Nathaniel Preston, heard you were working down Abilene way. What brings you up north?" "Just passing through, Garrett," Nathaniel said, his voice level and calm, though Katherine could see the tension in his shoulders. Passing through, the man called Garrett repeated mockingly. Or for that is all you ever do, is it not? Just drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. Some men are just born to wander, I suppose. Some men prefer it that way, Nathaniel replied evenly. Garrett laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. And some men run because they do not have the guts to face their past. Which one are you, Preston? Katherine saw Nathaniel's jaw tighten, saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. The tension in the store had ratcheted up several notches, and the other customers were watching nervously, clearly sensing that violence might erupt at any moment. Leave it alone, Garrett, Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Or what? Garrett challenged, pushing even closer. You going to do something about it? We both know you would not dare. Not after what happened in Dodge. Katherine did not know what had happened in Dodge, but she knew enough to recognize a man being baited into a fight. She also knew that Nathaniel was outnumbered 3-1, and that whatever happened in the next few minutes could end very badly. She set down the bolt of fabric and walked quickly toward the front of the store. All eyes turned to her as she stepped up beside Nathaniel and slipped her arm through his in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. There you are, she said brightly, smiling up at Nathaniel as though nothing were amiss. I have finished selecting our supplies. Are you ready to go? Nathaniel looked down at her, surprise clear in his eyes. But he recovered quickly, understanding what she was doing. Yes, he said, matching her light tone. Let me help you with those. Katherine turned to Garrett and his companions, giving them a polite but dismissive smile. Gentlemen, if you will excuse us, we have a long ride back to our homestead. She emphasized the word our deliberately, marking Nathaniel as someone who belonged, someone who was not alone. Garrett looked between her and Nathaniel, his scarred face twisting into an ugly expression that might have been anger or might have been something else. Your homestead, he repeated slowly. Well, is that not sweet? Preston found himself a widow woman to take care of him. Katherine felt Nathaniel tense beside her, but she squeezed his arm warningly. My late husband's homestead, and soon to be mine officially when the well is registered, she said coolly, which is what we came to town to do, along with picking up supplies. Now, if you will excuse us. She guided Nathaniel toward the counter where the storekeeper, an older man named Elias Hoffman, who had always been kind to Katherine, was watching the confrontation with worried eyes. Mr. Hoffman, could you please total up my purchases? We need to get to the land office before it closes. Of course, Mrs. Hartley, Hoffman said quickly, clearly relieved to have an excuse to end the confrontation. Let me just tally these up for you. As Hoffman calculated her bill, Katherine kept her hand on Nathaniel's arm, very aware of the three men still watching them from across the store. Garrett looked like he wanted to push the issue further, but his companions were urging him toward the door, apparently having decided that causing trouble in front of witnesses was not worth whatever satisfaction they might gain. See you around, Preston, Garrett called over his shoulder as they left. Real soon. The tension in the store evaporated as the door closed behind them. Katherine released the breath she had been holding and felt Nathaniel do the same beside her. Thank you, he said quietly, looking down at her with an expression of mingled gratitude and something deeper, something that made her heart skip a beat. Who was that? Katherine asked, keeping her voice low. Nobody worth talking about, Nathaniel replied, but she could see the shadows in his eyes and knew there was more to the story. They completed their transaction with Hoffman, who insisted on throwing in an extra pound of coffee at no charge, apparently his way of thanking them for not letting the situation escalate into violence in his store. Then they carried the supplies out to the wagon and loaded them in the back. As Katherine climbed up onto the wagon seat, she saw Garrett and his companions standing outside the saloon across the street watching them. She felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat of the day. There was something in the way they were looking at Nathaniel, a kind of malevolent intensity that spoke of old grudges and unfinished business. Nathaniel followed her gaze and his expression hardened, but he said nothing. Just climbed up beside her and took the reins. They drove to the land office where Katherine registered the completion of her well and received the official papers that would allow her to prove up her claim once she had lived on the land for the required 5 years. The clerk, a bored-looking young man, barely glanced at Nathaniel, clearly assuming he was Catherine's hired help. By the time they left town, it was approaching noon, and the heat was intense. They rode in silence for the first few miles, Katherine very aware that the easy companionship of the previous days had been replaced by something more complex, more fraught with things unsaid. Finally, she could not stand it anymore. "Are you in trouble?" she asked bluntly. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his hands steady on the reins. Katherine was beginning to think he was not going to respond at all when he finally spoke. "It depends on what you mean by trouble," he said carefully. "I am not wanted by the law, if that is what you are asking, but Garrett and I have history, and it is not good history." "What kind of history?" Katherine pressed. Nathaniel sighed. "The kind that involves whiskey and cards and a girl who was not nearly as unattached as she claimed to be. Garrett thought I had cheated him out of money and stolen his woman, neither of which was true, but he has carried a grudge ever since, and he's not the kind of man who lets grudges go." "Will he come after you?" Katherine asked, worry tightening her chest. "Maybe," Nathaniel admitted. "Probably, which is why I should move on sooner rather than later. No point in bringing trouble to your doorstep." Katherine felt that same sharp disappointment she had experienced the previous evening, but this time it was mixed with something else, something that felt dangerously close to panic. "What if I do not want you to go?" she heard herself say. The words hung in the air between them. Nathaniel turned to look at her, his gray-blue eyes searching her face. "Katherine," he said, and her name in his rough voice sent shivers down her spine despite the heat. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Katherine replied, surprised by her own boldness. "I know you helped me when you did not have to. I know you work hard and do not shirk difficult tasks. I know you are honest and respectful and—" She trailed off, suddenly shy about finishing the thought. "And what?" Nathaniel prompted gently. "And I have been alone for 3 months," Katherine admitted. "Truly alone in a way I never was even when Thomas was alive, because he was so often gone, working in town or checking the trap lines. And these past few days, with you here, I have not felt alone. I have felt like maybe I could actually make this work, actually survive out here, and I do not want to go back to feeling alone." Nathaniel pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the empty trail. He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes made Katherine's breath catch. "I am a drifter," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I do not have anything to offer you. No land, no money to speak of, no prospects beyond the next ranch that might hire me. You deserve better than that. What I deserve is someone who sees me as more than just a burden or a duty," Katherine said fiercely. "What I deserve is someone who takes a shovel from my bleeding hands without a word because they understand what I need without me having to ask. What I deserve is someone who looks at me the way you have been looking at me for the past 3 days, like I am something worth noticing, worth caring about." "I have been looking at you like that?" Nathaniel asked, and there was a hint of wonder in his voice. "You have," Katherine confirmed, "and do not think I have not noticed the way your eyes follow me when you think I am not paying attention, or the way you find excuses to stand closer to me than strictly necessary." A slow smile spread across Nathaniel's face, transforming his features and making him look younger, almost boyish. "I thought I was being subtle about that." "You were not," Katherine said. But she was smiling too, feeling giddy and reckless and more alive than she had felt in years. "Katherine," Nathaniel said again. And this time when he spoke her name, it sounded like a prayer. He reached out and cupped her cheek with one calloused hand, his thumb brushing gently across her sun-warmed skin. "If I stay, Garrett might come looking for me. He might cause trouble for you for your homestead. I could not live with myself if something happened to you because of me. If you leave, I will be alone again," Katherine countered. "And there are plenty of dangers for a woman alone on the prairie that have nothing to do with old grudges. At least with you here, I would have someone watching my back, someone I trust." She could see the war playing out in Nathaniel's expression, the desire to stay battling with his sense of honor, and his fear of bringing danger to her door. Katherine made a decision then, one that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat, Nathaniel froze, clearly shocked. Then he was kissing her back, his hand sliding from her cheek to tangle in her hair, his other arm coming around her waist to pull her closer. The kiss was fierce and desperate, and full of all the longing that had been building between them over the past days. Katherine felt like she was burning up from the inside out, every nerve ending singing with sensation. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "You are making it very difficult for me to do the right thing here," he said, his voice rough. "Maybe the right thing is not what you think it is," Katherine replied softly. "Maybe the right thing is to stay and build something together instead of running from shadows and old ghosts." Nathaniel pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel like he was seeing straight into her soul. "If I stay, I am staying for real," he said seriously. "Not as hired help, not as a temporary solution to your problems. I am staying as your partner, if you will have me, your husband, if you are willing." Katherine felt her heart leap into her throat. "You are proposing to me?" she asked, hardly able to believe it. "I suppose I am," Nathaniel said, and he looked almost as surprised as she felt. "I know it is fast, probably too fast, but out here on the frontier things move differently. Life is harder and shorter, and we do not have the luxury of long courtships. And I know, somehow I just know that you are what I have been looking for without even realizing I was searching. A home, a purpose, a reason to stop drifting and put down roots." "Yes," Katherine said, the word tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "Yes, I will marry you. I will have you as my partner and my husband and whatever else you want to be." Nathaniel's answering smile was brilliant, full of joy and relief, and something that looked a lot like love. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. When they finally separated, he picked up the reins and set the wagon moving again, one arm still around Katherine's waist, keeping her close. They made plans as they drove back to the homestead. They would go back to town the next day and find the circuit preacher, if he was available, or the justice of the peace if he was not. They would marry quickly and quietly, with no fuss or ceremony beyond what was legally required. Nathaniel would file on the adjacent quarter section, the one that bordered Katherine's property to the west, and they would work both homesteads together, building something larger and more sustainable than either could manage alone. It was practical and sensible and also deeply romantic, at least to Katherine's mind. This was not the fairy tale marriage of the dime novels she had occasionally read, full of grand gestures and flowery declarations. This was something real and solid, built on mutual respect and shared hardship and the spark of attraction that had flared between them from that first moment when he had taken the shovel from her blistered hands. When they arrived back at the homestead, Nathaniel unhitched the horses and tended to them while Katherine carried the supplies into the house. The well stood nearby, its stone lining visible above ground level, a testament to what they had already accomplished together. Katherine looked at it and felt a surge of optimism about the future. That evening they worked together to complete the framing for the well, building a sturdy wooden structure that would support a pulley system for drawing water. Nathaniel had a natural skill for carpentry, his movements sure and economical, as he measured and cut and nailed the timbers together. Katherine assisted where she could, holding boards steady and handing him tools, enjoying the simple pleasure of working alongside him. As the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, they lowered the first bucket into the well and drew up clear, cold water. Katherine filled her cupped hands and drank deeply, the taste of success somehow sweeter than the water itself. Nathaniel drank too, then splashed some over his face and neck, grinning at her through the dripping water. "We did good work," he said, gesturing at the completed well. "We did," Katherine agreed, "and we will do more, together." That night they sat outside long after the meal was finished, talking quietly about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Nathaniel told her about his childhood in Virginia, about learning to farm and hunt from his father, about the terror and chaos of the war years. Katherine told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents who had died of influenza when she was 16, about meeting Thomas at a church social and agreeing to marry him because she needed security and he needed a wife to help prove up his homestead claim. "Did you love him?" Nathaniel asked. And there was no jealousy in the question, only curiosity. Katherine considered this honestly. "I cared for him," she said slowly. "He was a good man, and he treated me well. But love? No, I do not think what we had was love. It was partnership, companionship, but not passion. Does that sound terrible?" "No," Nathaniel said. "It sounds honest, and maybe realistic. A lot of marriages out here are based on practicality rather than romance." "And ours?" Katherine asked, looking at him in the starlight. "What will ours be based on?" Nathaniel reached out and took her bandaged hand in his, holding it gently. "I think ours has a chance to be both," he said. "Practical, yes, because we need each other to survive this land, but also something more. Something that makes my heart beat faster when I look at you. Something that made me ride up to your homestead 3 days ago and know immediately that I could not just pass on by." "You really felt that?" Katherine asked softly. "That first day?" "I really did," Nathaniel confirmed. "I saw you standing there with your bleeding hands and your stubborn determination, refusing to quit even though the task was clearly beyond your strength. And something in my chest just cracked open. I knew I had to help you, and then I knew I had to stay." Katherine felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes for the second time in as many days, but these were happy tears, full of hope rather than despair. She leaned her head against Nathaniel's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie wind whispered through the grass. They returned to Hays City the next morning, arriving just after the town had begun to stir. The circuit preacher, a round-faced man named Reverend Mitchell, happened to be in town, and he agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon in the small church at the edge of town. They needed witnesses, so Katherine asked Mr. Hoffman from the general store, and Nathaniel asked the owner of the livery stable, a weathered old-timer named Jack who had given him advice about finding work when he first passed through town. Katherine had nothing resembling a wedding dress, so she wore her best calico with a clean apron and a ribbon in her hair. Nathaniel had purchased a new shirt from Hoffman's store, white cotton that made his tanned skin look even darker by contrast. They stood before Reverend Mitchell in the small church, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and spoke their vows. Katherine's voice trembled slightly as she promised to love, honor, and cherish Nathaniel until death parted them. Nathaniel's voice was steady and sure as he made the same promises to her. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed her gently, almost reverently, as though she were something precious and fragile. Hoffman and Jack congratulated them warmly, and Hoffman insisted on giving them a bottle of wine as a wedding gift, waving away Katherine's protests. Jack offered them a room at the hotel for the night, also as a gift, but Nathaniel politely declined, saying they wanted to get back to the homestead before dark. It was the truth, but Katherine suspected there was more to it. Nathaniel was worried about Garrett and his companions, worried about what trouble they might cause if they learned about the marriage. He wanted to get Katherine back to the relative safety of the homestead as quickly as possible. They made good time on the return journey, pushing the horses harder than was perhaps wise in the heat. But they reached the homestead with an hour or so of daylight remaining, and Nathaniel immediately set about checking the property, making sure nothing had been disturbed in their absence. Katherine prepared a special meal for their wedding supper, using some of the fresh supplies they had purchased and breaking out the wine that Hoffman had gifted them. They ate outside as the sun set, toasting their marriage with tin cups full of wine and laughing at the absurdity and perfection of it all. "I cannot believe I've been married twice in 3 years," Katherine said, shaking her head, "and the second time to a man I have known less than a week." "Having regrets already?" Nathaniel asked, but his tone was teasing rather than worried. "Not even a little," Katherine replied honestly. "It feels right somehow, like this was always meant to happen." "I know what you mean," Nathaniel said. I spent years drifting, never finding a place that felt like home. And then I saw you digging that well, and suddenly I knew, this is home. You are home." They finished their meal as the stars emerged, and then Nathaniel stood and offered Katherine his hand. "May I escort you inside, wife?" he asked formally. "You may, husband," Katherine replied, taking his hand and rising. Inside the small house, in the darkness of the bedroom, they came together as husband and wife for the first time. Nathaniel was gentle with her, mindful of her injured hands and her relative innocence. Thomas had been her only lover before this, and their physical relationship had been perfunctory at best, a duty performed rather than a pleasure shared. But with Nathaniel, it was different. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, like he had all the time in the world to explore the taste and feel of her mouth. His hands moved over her body with a combination of reverence and hunger that made Katherine feel cherished and desired in equal measure. When he finally moved inside her, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Katherine's head resting on Nathaniel's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her back, and she felt more content than she could ever remember feeling. "I love you," Nathaniel said into the darkness, his voice quiet but firm. "I know it is too soon, and I probably should not say it yet, but it is true. I love you, Katherine Preston." Katherine felt her heart swell at hearing her new name, at the declaration she had not dared to hope for. "I love you too," she whispered back, "probably have since that first moment you took the shovel from my hands." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Katherine did not dream of her late husband or her struggles with the well. She dreamed instead of the future, of a home built together, of children running through the prairie grass, of growing old with the man who had wandered into her life at exactly the right moment. The next week passed in a blur of hard work and domestic happiness. Nathaniel rode into town to file on the adjacent quarter section, beginning the process of proving up his own homestead claim. Together they worked to improve both properties, repairing fences, clearing land, and planning where they would plant crops in the spring. Katherine's hands healed slowly but surely, the blisters forming calluses that would serve her well in the hard work ahead. She taught Nathaniel how to milk her cow and care for the chickens, while he taught her tricks for reading the prairie weather and identifying edible plants that grew wild on the grasslands. They were building a partnership, a real one, based on mutual respect and shared labor. But there was also passion, a physical connection that neither of them had experienced before. They came together in the darkness of the night with a hunger that never seemed to fully abate, learning each other's bodies and preferences, finding joy in the simple act of giving and receiving pleasure. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. They rose before dawn and worked until dusk, tackling the endless list of tasks that frontier life demanded. They ate their meals together, talking about their day and making plans for the future. They went to bed exhausted and woke up ready to do it all over again. It was hard, back-breaking work, but Katherine had never been happier. She had a partner who truly saw her as an equal, who valued her opinions and her contributions. She had a husband who looked at her with desire and affection in his eyes. She had a home that was truly hers, not just something she was occupying as a temporary guest. 3 weeks after their wedding, trouble finally arrived in the form of Garrett and his 2 companions. Katherine was in the house kneading bread dough when she heard shouting from outside. She looked through the window and felt her blood run cold. Garrett sat astride his horse in the yard, his 2 friends flanking him. Nathaniel stood between them and the house, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Katherine could not hear what they were saying, but the body language was clear enough. This was a confrontation, and it had the potential to turn deadly. Katherine wiped the flour from her hands and grabbed Thomas's old rifle from where it hung above the door. She checked that it was loaded, then stepped outside, letting the door slam behind her to announce her presence. All eyes turned to her. Garrett's face twisted into something ugly when he saw the rifle in her hands. "Well, well," he drawled. "The little wife comes to defend her man. How touching." "This is private property," Katherine said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "You are trespassing. I suggest you leave." "Or what?" Garrett challenged. "You're going to shoot us, 3 against 2, and one of you a woman? I do not think you want to play those odds, sweetheart." "Those odds look better when you consider that I'm a dead shot with this rifle," Katherine said coolly, "and that you are sitting on a horse, which makes you a nice big target. So I will ask one more time politely, please leave our property." She saw a surprise flicker across Garrett's scarred face, followed by a grudging respect. He had underestimated her, assuming she would be a timid frontier wife who would cower in the house while the men settled their dispute. But Katherine had not survived Thomas's death and months of solitary homesteading by being timid. "I'm not here to cause trouble with you, madam," Garrett said, switching tactics. "I just have some unfinished business with Preston here, old debts that need settling." "Whatever debts you think exist, they are forgiven," Nathaniel said firmly. "I am not the same man I was in Dodge, Garrett. I have a wife now, a homestead, a future. I am not going to throw that away over old grudges." "Maybe I am not ready to forgive," Garrett replied, his hand moving to rest on his own gun. Katherine saw Nathaniel tense, saw his fingers flex near his weapon. Everything seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. She raised the rifle smoothly, sighting down the barrel at Garrett's chest. "Draw that gun, and I will drop you before it clears the holster," she said, and the absolute conviction in her voice made Garrett freeze. "I do not care what happened in Dodge. I do not care about old debts or grudges or whatever it is you think justifies riding onto my property and threatening my husband. This is my land, bought and paid for with blood and sweat and tears, and I will defend it and everything on it with my life if necessary." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then one of Garrett's companions, a lean man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Come on, Garrett, this is not worth it. Let's just go." "Yeah," the other one agreed. "Preston's not worth getting shot over, and that woman looks like she means business." Garrett stared at Katherine for a long moment, his hand still hovering near his gun. Then, slowly, he relaxed, moving his hand away from the weapon and back to his saddle horn. "You're right," he said to his companions, though his eyes never left Katherine's face. "It is not worth it. Preston always did have more luck than sense." He gathered his reins, preparing to turn his horse. "Enjoy your homestead, Preston. Enjoy your wife. But watch your back. Luck has a way of running out." Then he wheeled his horse and kicked it into a gallop, his companions following. Katherine and Nathaniel stood frozen, watching until the 3 riders disappeared over a rise in the prairie, heading east toward town. As soon as they were out of sight, Katherine's arms began to shake, the adrenaline draining out of her system. Nathaniel was beside her immediately, gently taking the rifle from her trembling hands and setting it aside. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "That was the bravest and most foolish thing I have ever seen," he said into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Katherine replied, her face pressed against his chest, "and I was not about to stand by and let that happen without a fight." Nathaniel pulled back enough to look down at her, his gray-blue eyes intense. "I do not deserve you," he said fiercely, "but I am so grateful I found you." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the afternoon sun, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the prairie. Eventually they went back inside, and Katherine returned to her bread dough while Nathaniel checked the perimeter of the property, making sure Garrett and his companions had truly left. Over dinner that evening they discussed what had happened. Nathaniel was worried that Garrett might return, might try to cause more trouble. Katherine agreed it was a possibility, but she also thought that the confrontation had resolved something. Garrett had seen that Nathaniel was truly settled, truly changed, and he had also seen that Katherine was not someone to be trifled with. With any luck, his pride would keep him from admitting he had been faced down by a woman with a rifle, and he would simply move on. As it turned out, Katherine's instincts were correct. They heard through the grapevine, courtesy of Mr. Hoffman on their next trip to town, that Garrett and his companions had moved on, heading south toward the cattle trails of Texas. Apparently, Garrett had told everyone in the saloon that there was no work to be found in Kansas, and he was seeking better opportunities elsewhere. He never mentioned the confrontation at the Preston homestead, and Nathaniel and Katherine were content to let the story die. As summer gave way to fall, the work on the homesteads continued. Nathaniel proved to be as good as his word, working tirelessly to improve both properties. He built a larger barn, repaired the roof on the house, and even constructed a proper chicken coop to replace the ramshackle structure that had been there before. Katherine worked alongside him, tending to the animals, preserving food for the winter, and helping with the physical labor when extra hands were needed. She was stronger now than she had been when Nathaniel first rode up to her well, her body hardened by months of frontier life. She could work a full day without collapsing, could handle a team of horses or shoot a rifle with equal competence. They were becoming true partners in every sense of the word, their initial attraction deepening into something richer and more complex. They knew each other's moods and habits, could anticipate each other's needs, worked together with the kind of synchronicity that usually took years to develop. In late October, Katherine realized that her monthly courses were late. She waited another week, not wanting to get her hopes up, but when there was still no sign of bleeding, she allowed herself to believe that she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain, until the nausea and fatigue had become undeniable before telling Nathaniel. She chose a quiet evening after supper, when they were sitting outside watching the sunset. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Nathaniel looked at her, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" "I am with child," Katherine said simply. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Nathaniel just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a slow, wondering smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "Truly?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Truly," Katherine confirmed, smiling back at him. "I think it must have happened our first night together or soon after. The baby should come in late May or early June." Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that brought tears to Katherine's eyes. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. I am going to be a father." "And I am going to be a mother," Katherine said, the reality of it hitting her fully for the first time. "I am terrified and thrilled in equal measure." "We will figure it out together," Nathaniel promised, "just like we have figured out everything else." The winter was long and hard, with snowstorms that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the well froze solid. But the house was warm and well stocked with supplies, and Nathaniel had built up a substantial pile of firewood. They spent the long, dark evenings by the fire, Nathaniel carving wooden toys for the baby, while Katherine sewed tiny gowns and blankets. As her belly grew, Katherine found herself slowing down, unable to work at the pace she had maintained before. Nathaniel took on more of the physical labor without complaint, insisting that she rest and take care of herself and the baby. He was solicitous in a way that was both endearing and sometimes frustrating, constantly worrying about her health and comfort. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared on the prairie, a new family moved onto the homestead to the north of Katherine and Nathaniel's property. They were a young couple from Ohio, James and Sarah Wilson, with 2 small children. Katherine was delighted to have neighbors, especially another woman with whom she could talk and share the challenges of frontier life. Sarah was expecting her 3rd child, due around the same time as Katherine, and the 2 women quickly formed a friendship. They traded recipes and sewing patterns, helped each other with the endless domestic tasks, and commiserated about the discomforts of pregnancy in a land with limited medical care. The men, too, became friends, working together on projects that benefited both homesteads. They helped each other repair fences and plow fields, creating a small community where before there had been only isolation. Katherine's labor began on a warm evening in early June, right on schedule. Sarah came to help, bringing her experience and calm competence. Nathaniel paced outside, alternating between relief that it was finally happening and terror that something might go wrong. The labor was long and difficult. lasting through the night and into the next day. Katherine endured it with gritted teeth and determination, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. Sarah coached her through the contractions, wiping her face with cool cloths and murmuring encouragement. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Katherine gave one final push and felt the baby slip free. The sound of a newborn's cry filled the small room, and Katherine collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but exhilarated. "It is a boy," Sarah announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket and placing him in Katherine's arms. "A big, healthy boy." Katherine looked down at her son, at his red face and waving fists, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, from his dark hair that reminded her of Nathaniel's to his tiny fingers that gripped her hand with surprising strength. Nathaniel was allowed in then, and the look on his face when he saw his son was something Katherine knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Wonder, joy, fear, love, all mixed together in an expression of such raw emotion that it made her eyes fill with tears. "He is beautiful," Nathaniel whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one calloused finger. "Just like his mother." They named him William Thomas Preston, after Nathaniel's father and Katherine's late husband, honoring the past while looking toward the future. The baby was strong and healthy, nursing well and growing quickly. Nathaniel was a devoted father, taking his turn walking the floor with William when he cried at night, changing soiled diapers without complaint, and staring at his son with an expression of besotted wonder whenever he thought Katherine was not looking. As summer turned to fall and then winter once again, the Preston homestead continued to grow and prosper. They had a successful harvest that first year, enough to see them through the winter with plenty left over to sell in town. Nathaniel continued to make improvements to the property, building a proper smokehouse and digging a root cellar that would keep their vegetables fresh through the cold months. Katherine regained her strength after William's birth, resuming her share of the work around the homestead. She was a capable mother, patient and loving with her son while still maintaining the toughness that frontier life demanded. William thrived under her care, growing into a chubby, happy baby who rarely cried and seemed fascinated by everything around him. The Wilsons became true friends, the two families celebrating holidays together and helping each other through the inevitable crises that frontier life brought. When Sarah's third child was born, a daughter named Emma, Katherine helped deliver the baby, repaying the assistance Sarah had given her during William's birth. More settlers arrived over the next few years, filing on homesteads in the area and creating a small but thriving community. A schoolhouse was built, and then a small church, giving the scattered families places to gather and socialize. Katherine found herself part of a network of women who supported each other through the challenges of frontier life, sharing resources and knowledge and companionship. Nathaniel proved up his homestead claim after the required 5 years, and Katherine did the same with hers. They now owned 320 acres of Kansas prairie, free and clear. It was not a massive holding by some standards, but it was theirs, bought with their labor and their determination. William was joined by 2 siblings over the next few years, a daughter they named Rose, who had Katherine's auburn hair and Nathaniel's gray-blue eyes, and then another son, Henry, who was the spitting image of his father. The house grew more crowded and more chaotic, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and occasional tears. Katherine sometimes thought back to that day when she'd been digging the well alone, her hands raw and bleeding, with no idea how she was going to survive. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. She had been so alone then, so desperate and afraid, convinced that the frontier was going to break her. But then Nathaniel had ridden up on his bay mare, had taken the shovel from her hands without a word, and everything had changed. He had given her not just help with the well, but hope for the future. He had shown her that she did not have to face the challenges of frontier life alone, that partnership and love could make even the hardest circumstances bearable. On their 10th anniversary, Nathaniel surprised her by taking her to Hayes City for a proper celebration. They left the children with Sarah and James and spent the night at the hotel, the same one Jack had offered them as a wedding gift all those years ago. They ate dinner in the hotel dining room, a fancy meal with white tablecloths and multiple courses, so different from their usual simple fare. Afterward, in their room, Nathaniel gave her a gift. It was a cameo brooch, delicate and beautiful, with a woman's profile carved in ivory against a dark background. Katherine held it with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Nathaniel, this must have cost a fortune," she protested. "We cannot afford such extravagance." "We can afford it," Nathaniel assured her. "The last few harvests have been good and I have been saving. I wanted to give you something special, something that showed you how much I appreciate everything you have done, everything you are." Katherine pinned the brooch to her dress, then threw her arms around her husband's neck. "I do not need gifts to know that you appreciate me," she said softly, "but I will treasure this always." They made love that night with the same passion they had shared on their wedding night, the years of familiarity only adding depth to their physical connection. Katherine fell asleep in Nathaniel's arms, feeling grateful for the unexpected path her life had taken. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. They lost a fourth child, a daughter born too early who lived only a few hours. Katherine grieved deeply, and Nathaniel grieved with her, holding her through the dark nights when the loss felt overwhelming. But they had each other and their 3 healthy children, and gradually the sharp edge of grief dulled into a bittersweet ache. William grew into a serious, hard-working boy who idolized his father and spent every possible moment learning to work the land. Rose was spirited and independent, more interested in riding horses and exploring the prairie than in the domestic arts her mother tried to teach her. Henry was the baby, charming and mischievous, able to talk his way out of trouble with a gap-toothed smile. Hayes City grew from a rough frontier town into a proper settlement, with paved streets and brick buildings and all the amenities of civilization. The railroad brought more people and more opportunities, and the Preston homestead became part of a thriving agricultural community rather than an isolated outpost. Katherine and Nathaniel grew older, their faces weathered by years of sun and wind, their bodies marked by the hard physical labor of frontier life. But they also grew closer, their love deepening with each passing year. They knew each other's thoughts almost before they were spoken, could communicate with a glance or a touch, had built a partnership so strong that nothing could shake it. On a warm summer evening in 1893, exactly 20 years after that fateful day when Nathaniel had taken the shovel from Katherine's blistered hands, they sat together on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the prairie. William was married now, living on his own homestead with his wife and infant son. Rose was courting a young man from town, much to Katherine's mixed delight and dismay at the thought of her daughter leaving home. Henry was 16, tall and lanky and full of restless energy. "Do you ever regret it?" Katherine asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Staying here, giving up the wandering life?" Nathaniel turned to look at her, his gray-blue eyes still as striking as they had been 2 decades ago, though now surrounded by fine lines and crow's feet. "Not for a single day," he said firmly. "This is where I was meant to be, with you, building this life, raising our children. This is home." Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the dependable strength that had been her anchor through 20 years of frontier life. "I love you," she said simply. "I loved you then, when you took that shovel without a word, and I love you now. I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Nathaniel replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You gave me something I did not even know I was searching for: purpose, belonging, a reason to stop running and build something that would last." They sat there as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, The prairie stretched out around them, vast and beautiful and harsh, the land they had tamed together through sheer determination and partnership. The well that had brought them together still stood, its stone lining weathered but solid, a testament to what could be accomplished when two people worked together toward a common goal. Their children would inherit this land, would carry on the legacy that Katherine and Nathaniel had built together. William would work the Preston homestead, Rose would likely end up on a neighboring property with her young man, and Henry would eventually file on land of his own and start the cycle anew. The community they had helped create would continue to grow and thrive, built on the same values of hard work, mutual support, and stubborn determination that had characterized the early settlers. Katherine thought about all the moments that had led to this one, the drought that had killed Thomas and left her alone, the desperate days of digging the well with bleeding hands, the moment when she had looked up to see a lone rider approaching across the prairie, the instant when Nathaniel had taken the shovel from her grip, that first gesture of help that had turned into so much more. Every hardship, every challenge, every moment of despair had been worth it to get to this point, to this place of peace and contentment and deep, abiding love. The frontier had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, had pushed her to the very edge of her endurance, but it had also given her gifts beyond measure, a true partner, a loving family, a home that was really and truly hers. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Katherine felt Nathaniel press a kiss to the top of her head. It was a gesture he had made thousands of times over the years, but it never failed to warm her heart. This was what she had fought for, what she had bled for, what she had nearly broken herself trying to achieve. Not just survival, but a life worth living. Not just existence, but joy. The well that had brought them together still provided water for the homestead, its depths cool and clear even in the driest summers. But it had given them so much more than just water. It had given them each other, and from that single moment of connection had grown an entire life, rich and full and deeply satisfying. Katherine closed her eyes and smiled, content in the knowledge that she had found exactly what she needed in the most unexpected way. A drifting cowboy who had taken a shovel from her blistered hands without a word, and in doing so had given her everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to dream. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of summer and the promise of harvest to come. And Katherine Preston, née Hartley, formerly a desperate widow digging a well alone, sat with her husband on their porch and watched the stars emerge, grateful for every moment that had led her to this perfect, hard-won happiness. Years continued to flow like the water from that well, steady and life-giving. Katherine and Nathaniel grew old together, their love never diminishing even as their bodies slowed and their hair turned silver. They became grandparents multiple times over, their house once again filled with the sounds of children's laughter when their grandchildren came to visit. The homestead prospered under their careful stewardship and later under William's management. New technologies came to Kansas, making farming easier but never easy. The wild frontier days gradually faded into memory, replaced by a more settled, civilized life. But Katherine and Nathaniel never forgot where they had come from, never took for granted the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love. On a spring morning in 1910, Katherine woke to find Nathaniel still asleep beside her, his weathered face peaceful in the early light. She studied him for a long moment, memorizing the beloved features, the way silver had replaced the dark in his hair, the deep lines that marked a life well lived. Then she rose carefully, not wanting to wake him, and went about her morning routine. She made coffee, the same ritual they had shared for nearly 4 decades, and stepped outside to watch the sunrise. The prairie was green with spring growth, promising another good year. The well still stood, a permanent fixture now, surrounded by the thriving homestead they had built together. Rose had married her young man and lived just 5 miles away with her own growing family. Henry had filed on land to the south and was making a success of his own homestead. William and his wife were still in the main house, having taken over the day-to-day running of the property, while Katherine and Nathaniel enjoyed a well-earned semi-retirement in the smaller house William had built for them nearby. It was everything Katherine had hoped for and more, a legacy that would continue long after she and Nathaniel were gone. Children and grandchildren who knew the value of hard work and family, land that would remain in the Preston name for generations to come. Nathaniel emerged from the house, moving more slowly than he once had, but still strong and capable. He came to stand beside her, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him with a smile of thanks. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, just as they had done countless mornings before. "Beautiful morning," Nathaniel observed, his voice still carrying that rough, gravelly quality that Katherine loved. "It is," Katherine agreed, "just like all the mornings we have shared together." Nathaniel turned to look at her, his gray-blue eyes still sharp despite his years. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question she had once posed to him. Katherine considered this seriously, as she always did with important questions. She thought about the hardships they had endured, the children they had lost, the years of back-breaking labor and constant struggle. She thought about the life she might have had if Thomas had not died, if the well had somehow been completed before Nathaniel rode into her life. "Not a single one," she said finally, absolutely certain. "Every moment, good and bad, led me to you, led us to this. How could I possibly regret that?" Nathaniel smiled, that slow, warm smile that had always made her heart flutter. He set down his coffee cup and pulled her into his arms, holding her close despite the years that had bent them both. Katherine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt completely at peace. They had started with a well and a shovel and hands too blistered to continue digging. They had built an empire of love and family and purpose from that simple beginning. And now, as they stood together watching another day begin on the Kansas prairie they had made their own, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that every blister, every drop of sweat, every moment of doubt and fear had been worth it. Because in the end, she had not just found water. She had found a home. She had found a partner. She had found love in its truest, deepest form. And that was worth more than all the gold in California or all the cattle in Texas. That was worth everything. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the earth and promising another day of the good, hard work that had defined their lives. And Katherine and Nathaniel Preston stood together, as they had for nearly 40 years, facing whatever came next as partners, as friends, as the truest of soulmates. The cowboy who had taken the shovel without a word, and the woman whose blistered hands had needed help had found something rare and precious in each other, and they had built a life that would endure long after they were gone. It was, Katherine thought, as Nathaniel kissed her forehead in that familiar, beloved gesture, the very best kind of love story. The kind written not in flowery words but in shared labor and mutual respect. The kind that started with a simple act of kindness and grew into something that could weather any storm. The kind that proved beyond any doubt that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. And it had all begun with a well, a shovel, and two people who were brave enough to build something beautiful together from the harsh, unforgiving soil of the Kansas frontier.